with an actor-centric approach, very promising. I think the networks of aid organizations first, and then resistance groups. And I suggest we will have the same mode as yesterday, so the 2 presentations in a row and then the discussion. To the speakers, please try to keep it in good time, in 25 minutes. I will cut you off if you are too long. So the first paper we have today is by Sinja Clavadetscher. She is one of the 2 PhD students in Stefanie Marer's project, working on academic refugee aid and international, also national, I think, organizations. A very promising project, which I'm interested to learn more about just now. Sinja has done her master thesis in European history in Basel and graduated with a paper on Jewish history, I think, and she will present today a paper called Aid Organizations for Academic Refugees from Germany after 1933, a Swiss example. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Marino. I will share my presentation. Is it okay, Marino?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so welcome to this first presentation of the panel and of today. As Marino said, I will present you some first insight of my PhD research. My research is part of the project of Stefanie Marer at the University of Bern. And my focus lies on aid organizations for academic refugees during the NS period. I am interested in the mechanisms of aid and in the factors of successful, but even also of unsuccessful assistance through these organizations. In the following minutes, I will first introduce you to the thematic of academic refugee organizations from 1933 onwards, and then the state of research, of course. Following an overview and classification of diverse aid organizations, I will illustrate some of my findings over one of the categories with a Swiss example. To the state of research. Substantial research has been done about the fate of academics in Germany during the NS period and about their immigration process as well. Most of the studies focus on specific academic fields or individual organizations, especially on the large ones such as the Rockefeller Foundation or the Academic Assistance Council. And other studies focus on the host countries of the émigré scholars. This means that researchers have already treated various aspects of assistance to academics, and there is much information available to me. Nevertheless, from my perspective, there is a lack of overview concerning aid organizations for academics on a macro level. Therefore, I decided this lack of overview makes it difficult to study the mechanism of all these organizations, as well as their actual impact on aid for refugees. Therefore, I decided to dedicate a part of my PhD to this overview. The goal is to create a working instrument, not only for me, but also for other future researchers. So I move on to the starting point of the organizations. Over 3,000 German academics lost their professional positions during the NS period. Most of them were Jewish by self-identification or by the racial laws of Nazi Germany. On April 7th, in 1933, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service was passed. In German, it is Gesetz zur Wiederherstellung des Berufsbeamtentums. This meant that Jews, other non-Aryans according to Nazi policy, and political opponents could no longer serve as teachers, professors, judges, or in every other governmental position. More or less half of these scientists emigrated primarily to other countries in Europe or the United States. Furthermore, German, and after 1938, also Austrian scientists went to other parts of the world, such as South America, Australia, and even Shanghai. Not only had the dismissed academics begun to look for professional alternatives abroad, the scientific community in Europe and the United States reacted to the crisis of their German colleagues as well. Soon after, April 1933, aid organizations emerged in various countries all over the continent and also overseas. Now, I give you a first insight in the overview of the existing aid organizations. For this, I looked through literature and archival sources of the League of Nations and collected the names of organizations that existed or emerged. On this slide, I listed over 40 organizations. This represents the status of my ongoing research, and it is probably only the tip of the iceberg. As I consider academic and scholar in a broad sense, I included organizations helping also professionals such as doctors, lawyers, and psychologists. As a first step to further research, I classified the organizations into different categories. Following the ideas of categorization proposed by Simon Lessig and Laura Leff a few years ago, I formed an own system and made 3 groups according to their organizational form. As you can see here, I will explain them shortly. On the left, you see the foundations. The prototype are the Rockefeller and the Carnegie Foundation, probably known to you. One of their main goals was to support science and research in the United States and overseas in a general sense. Their main aid concerning refugees, their main aid part concerning the refugees from Germany and Austria was the financing of positions. In the middle, there's the second category. It contains institutions and named also institutions. It contains universities or research institutes. A good and probably known example is the graduate faculty of the New School of Social Research in New York. She's called University in Exile. This type institutions provided research places for emigrants. Last but not least, the last group, named Aid Association, and is for now the largest one. I will mainly focus on them today, as well as in my research, because many of the organizations have not been explored in depth until yet. All these associations at the right-hand side neither were founded by an institution, nor were themselves an institution. Instead, a group of concerned people formed these associations or societies to help the dismissed scholars. These associations had an intermediary position. I suggest that they had an important role in supporting refugee scholars. If we focus now on this group, the question arises which form of support these aid associations gave to scholars. In general, the possibilities of support were the following: searching for potential positions at universities and other research institutions, help to emigration or even flight, with visas, tickets, etc., occasional funding of living costs in the country of arrival, trying to get funding for academic positions, and last but not least, communication between different aid organizations, as well as with agencies and with authorities. Not all associations supported academics in a general, but were specialized in professions or academic fields. What I like to emphasize here is the differences in the background of the founding members, which is visible in the bottom of the illustration. On the one hand, emigrated German scholars built up self-help organizations abroad. A good example, therefore, is die Notgemeinschaft deutschen Wissenschaftler im Ausland. In English, it is Emergency Community for German Scholar Abroad. On the other hand, scientists abroad founded aid societies for German and later Austrian scholars at risk. A considerable number of the before presented aid organizations are belonging to this category. The most famous probably is the Academic Assistance Council, later named the Society for Protection of Science and Learning, which was based in London and emerged in 1933. The AAC created a list with over 2,500 names of scholars at risk and developed therefore an important position between the different agents of aid for dismissed academics. Not only the AIC created such a list, but also smaller organizations as the Emergency Committee in Aid of Displaced Foreign Physicians and Medical Scientists, or the Notgemeinschaft. As you can see on the slide, there's the list which I found in the archives of the Notgemeinschaft. This list helped the associations in gaining an overview of all scholars at risk. And as such, they were working tools for support measures, for example, to find positions abroad. Now, I will try to illustrate some specificities and reflections of the aid associations based on the Hilfsgemeinschaft für deutsche Gelehrte. Translated in English, it is Swiss Aid Committee for German Refugees. I will name it Swiss Aid Committee for short. Now let me start with the status of research about this committee. If one writes about aid organizations for academics in Switzerland, the Notgemeinschaft, in English Emergency Community for German Scholars Abroad, is central. The Swiss Aid Committee, however, is mentioned only briefly in a few publications, but was never investigated in depth. Even more reason for me to have a closer look on it. For this presentation, I used archival sources from the archives of the University of Basel and from the Archives for Contemporary History in Zurich. Most of the material concerns the Basel branch of the association, but it gives insight to the parent organization as well. Now, in the second part of my presentation, I will focus on the first year of existence, especially the founding ideas of this Swiss Aid Committee, to give insights to this association's view or ideas. The association was founded by Swiss academics from Zurich University in August 1933. This means only a few months after April 1933, when the law for the restoration of the civil service was passed in Germany. The scientists reacted very quickly to these events in Germany, unlike politicians, but that's another story to tell. As it was typical at the time, the Swiss Aid Committee published a general appeal to the public to have attention or to search the attention of a wider public for the case of the dismissed scholars. The Swiss Aid Committee addressed their Swiss compatriots, especially the intellectually interested people. The reason for the appeal was, of course, to raise funds for the association. Donations and membership fees built the financial basis of the association's budget. To convince the Swiss people to donate, the authors first briefly described the situation of German scholars, but then the focus lied on moral reasons for support. The argumentation based strongly on the idea of reciprocity and highlighted the importance German science and art had in the past for Swiss intellectual and the broader public. So the main thoughts were: a lot of Swiss academics studied at German universities, which was important for their careers. Not only academics, but many men and women in Switzerland consummated German art, literature, and culture. Then, in the past century, Switzerland welcomed scholars in emergency, which brought then important cultural treasures to the country. The committee expressed furthermore understanding for the difficult situation of Swiss academics, but they pointed out that the German scholars were living in worse conditions. I will cite the end of the appeal, which summarizes the argumentation very well. It is the heart and the spirit that are invoked in us Swiss today. The bitter plight of the German refugees appeals to our hearts, but it is our spirit that is called upon by the sympathy for a great cultural community that we do not want to forget, even the most difficult times. This appeal has, of course, a strong connection to Swiss history and tradition. Nevertheless, it contains typical argumentation lines. This includes the appraisal of German universities and scientific landscape, which the Swiss had in common with the Americans. The idea of reciprocity is very much present in the appeal. It emphasizes the importance of scientific exchange that existed already before the Second World War. As already mentioned, this was not only true for Switzerland, but also in other countries, and we heard it also yesterday from Isabelle concerning the students. The already existing scientific mobility before the 1930s brought scientists in contact across borders. I suggest that these relationships were, at least to some extent, life-saving in this crisis. Furthermore, I would like to highlight that in early 1933, the founders of this kind of associations had already a profound sense of crisis with regard to what happened in Germany. They realized that their colleagues were in peril, their careers, even their lives were at stake. Moreover, the scientists in Switzerland and elsewhere saw German science as a whole in danger. This would have been a tremendous loss for science worldwide. Another possible reason for the fast reaction should be added here and is found in the literature. The scientists feared similar developments in their own countries. Now I move on to the main goals formulated by the Swiss Aid Committee in 1933. The committee wanted to provide refugees and especially their families with essentials for living. Moreover, they wanted to help them to find a job in Switzerland. And as a last resort, the committee was willing to organize humane travel conditions if there was no possibility for a scholar to stay in Switzerland. The first two goals fit into the general goals of these aid associations. The last one has a strong connection to Swiss policies because the government pushed refugees to travel to other countries. In November 1934, only 1.5 years after the foundation of the committee, a member gave a speech on a fundraising event in Zurich. He highlighted difficulties of the association and emphasized that it was not able to provide academic positions for the refugee scholars. This was due to the policies of the police for foreigners. To cite the speaker, Emil Brunner, to put it in one word, the aid agency ensures that these scholars and other academics do not have to starve. Brunner compared the aid committee with the AAC in London and told the audience that the Swiss association had a lack of funds to grant scholarships. As far as I know, membership fees also financed the AAC, and this financing was a common instrument, as I realized yesterday with the presentations from the three speakers. To which extent this fundraising through donations and membership fees was one of the major challenges of such aid associations is subject to my further research. Brunner stated that civil society groups supported the Swiss government's policies. This indication proves to be true for academic representatives. The documents I worked through about the local Basel branch of the Swiss Aid Committee show that there was resistance towards the cause of the emigrated scholars. Already in the founding days, it was very difficult to find a chair for the local branch. Only 2 years after the first letter from Zurich to Basel to found a local branch, a solution was found. Karl Barth was willing to represent the association in Basel from July 1935 onwards. Interestingly, Karl Barth himself was a refugee scholar and arrived shortly before in Switzerland. The last part of the presentation made clear that not all scientists and university members were welcoming the refugee scholars. If one studies documents of aid association like the Swiss Aid Association, mainly one perspective is shown. Scientists abroad perceive the situation in Germany as a crisis in a double sense. On the one hand, a dangerous situation for scientists in Germany themselves. On the other hand, they feared the loss of an excellent scientific community and knowledge for the world. Nevertheless, the difficulties encountered by the association offer a first impression of another part of the reality, namely the resistance of governments and local scholars. This will be deeper explored in the following panel by Stefanie Salvisberg. Furthermore, the case of Karl Barth I mentioned a couple of minutes ago could be a hint that aid associations needed the commitment of affected people to stabilize their association. The Swiss Aid Committee illustrates one of the three categories, namely the aid associations founded by scientists abroad. The categorization of all help organizations for academic refugees into foundations, institutions, and aid associations makes it possible for me to take a clearer look on aid associations and their role. Finally, I want to offer you some interesting ideas or thoughts that I would like to investigate in my further research. Aid associations were built by scholars and therefore had probably many direct personal contacts to the refugee. What was the role of this context in providing aid? Then, in what extent was the financial basis of aid associations important for a successful or unsuccessful aid? And then, how are the different types of aid organizations interconnected? These questions bring me to an end of my presentation, and then thank you very much for your attention and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sinja, for this absolutely fascinating insight into your research and into this committee. Also, I might say as a short remark that I find it very valuable that you tried to give work on a macro level and gather all this information, which is dispersed until now. And I think this will be an extremely valuable instrument for further research, also for people who work in the Cold War era, to see how this translated these different organizations into later times. So thank you very much. And we will move on to our second speaker then in time. Silvia is here now. I have to announce that her presentation will not be streamed. And now we have 30 minutes, I think, for discussion. I'm not going to say much, so to leave the floor open. We have two seemingly different aspects: aid and emergency relief, and resistance networks with elaborating visions of a future Europe or of values that count. And I just open the floor to questions. I'm sure there are many. Just hold your hand or the small digital virtual hand. Isabelle, Haffter, and after Robert Obermeier.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to ask a question to Sinja, if I may. I was wondering whether you know how independent the ad campaign in Switzerland could act. So do you know about conflicts with the government or especially with the Fremdenpolizei? Yeah, maybe you know already a little bit about this.
Thank you for your question. I know conflicts on two types. And on the one hand, there is the Fremdenpolizei. I call it foreign policy. I don't know how you would describe it in English. But the only thing I know until yet is that these foreign police or the policies of the Swiss government included the foreign police, of course, and that the organizations or this organization I looked through stated that they have problems to look for jobs or to get positions at university because of these policies, which then were supported according to the associations by the local universities or chairs. And then, but this I did not investigate in depth until yet, but if you see the correspondence between the Basel branch and the chair of the Basel branch and the scientists abroad, you see that there are many obstacles in the organizations themselves, as they are not willing to have new posts or new positions. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So now I have Robert, if he's finished with his cat, and then after Rudolf, and then Linda.
Sorry, he's always very eager to get into the picture if I start speaking. You can understand me? Okay, perfect. Thanks a lot for the interesting insights. I also have a question to Sinja. I'm doing research on, well, actually a few years later than your topic, so after 45, with 8 organizations for another group of fugitives. And I was wondering if you came across the role of the church, especially the Catholic Church in your context. So were there members of the clergy involved in these 8 programs, or was it merely like a purely scientific and academic form of aid? Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Until yet, I have no specific hints about Catholic help or aid organizations for academics. But of course, in the local committees, there were also Theologen, I don't know in English the word, that were into the committees or even had chairs. But I do not know yet what was the role of them, or if they had a Catholic or Protestant background that influenced their work. So for the moment, I cannot say more to this.
Okay, Rudolf?
Yeah, thank you both for the presentations. Want to ask Sinja, thank you for your explanations about your topic, and I understand that you are still currently in the middle of your work, but based on the primary source that you have seen, you have worked on up to this point. How would you evaluate the effectiveness of the large organizations and the smaller ones, like the ones that you're working on right now? I mean, do you think the smaller institutions would be more effective in helping the displaced German scholars, or do you think the larger one, probably they were more effective? And how do you see their results?
Thank you. This is a very difficult question for me now. But I think that neither only the smaller aid associations nor institutions or foundations alone were effective. So it was the interchange that was effective in the end. Because what I have seen in the archival sources was that the local committees had the contacts to the scholars. Often there were personal contacts that existed before, and then these lists could be made on the basis of personal contacts and information, and these lists were the basis also for foundations and institutions to finance positions abroad, or to to give positions to scholars, or to found this university in exile.
Right, and I mean, ask one quick one after that. I mean, the thing that I'm struggling with my own work as well is that, if we make a comparison between the institutional help and the personal help, I mean, in the scholars that you have seen, perhaps, do you think they really got the help that they need through this institutional network, or do you think it was actually the personal network that they had prior to the Nazi coming in 1932, 1933?
I would suppose that it was the personal network that brought them to help. But then without this institutional setting, you could not provide help, because often they acted not as, it was all for free. So if you have no this personal commitment, then it would not be possible. But there are some organizational structures that made the help effective, I would say.
Linda hat sich gemeldet.
Thank you very much. I just put my hand away. Yeah, thank you very much to both presenters. I also have questions to Sinja. First, maybe today or in the next days and weeks, I would love to hear and learn more about the Latin American aid organizations. Maybe you can give us an idea today or in our future cooperations. This would be my first question. The second one is also quite short. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the question of gender? Are there a lot of female scholars getting help or helping? So is there something, some observations you already can share with us? And one thought when I worked about the University of University of Vienna in Austro-Fascism and then National Socialism, there was always a gap between students and scholars. This were the finished, like the very young scholars, not scholars in real definitions, for example, for such aid organizations, but not students anymore. So they are, I just saw all these refugees in a gap. They just finished their PhD and then were persecuted by Austro-Fascism or National Socialism. And I wonder if these help organizations, they were just focused on the already established scholars, or would have younger scholars have chances to get aid, especially if you talk about context, networks, and private relations. You have this, the older you get, the more networks you have. So what about the young scholars? If you could tell us a little bit more about this, I would enjoy it. Thanks.
Okay, to begin with perhaps with your last question about the younger scholars, I think this is a very interesting point, because I'm not focusing on students, because, as you said, they have own organizations, and it is definitely so that the already big shots were the first one that were saved, and then you have the younger, or even the, I don't know, not even young, but just not the big shots. That was much more difficult to find positions, I think. But especially for them, the personal networks, but that's just my hypothesis, was important, because they were not known in the whole world. And especially, I know the case of Alvin Johnson with the University of Exile. He just founded this university to get all these people he knew in Germany to found his new institution and to support his kind of sociology. So I think for them the personal contacts were even more important as for the big shots. And then the gender question. In the Swiss aid associations, I found no women who was actually working for it, despite the secretary, which was a volunteer woman. And in the correspondence of scholars with these associations, there were, I think it was all about men. But then there is the British University, the British Federation of University Women, and there's also an American branch and a worldwide branch of this Federation of University Women, and they did implement a scholar program, but I did not have investigated it until now. But there's also already literature about it. And then your Latin American question, I cannot answer because I do not know yet, but that's also a big problem, and then a language problem, of course, to have all the organizations in Latin America and also in Eastern Europe. Hope. Yeah.
The early, I meant the early career scholars. Now I have the term when I ask for the young, early career, we could call them.
Yeah,
yes, we are.
But I think for them as well as the young,
Okay, dann habe ich Stefanie Mahrer und dann Pushpa kommen.
Here, yeah, thank you both for your presentations. I have
there's a question from Pushpa.
Hello, and thank you very much to both the speakers. It was really interesting talks. I just had an observation and a comment and a kind of a question for Sinja, which was that it's really interesting to note the emergence of voluntary associations and organizations in the context you're talking about, where people come together from whatever background and decide they're going to use their agency to do something about a huge, massive problem that sometimes might seem insurmountable to many people, but you still get these groups who think, yes, we can do something about this. And I was just wondering in the sort of context of Switzerland, because I was were you interested to note how many of these little organizations emerged? Because you had a hell of a list of them at the beginning of your talk. And also, I suppose I'm just wondering about the political culture. Was there, do you feel from your research that there was a sort of democratic space for these types of organizations to flourish autonomously without too much state interference or intervention to curtail their activities?
Thank you. I think in the beginning, they were, voluntary and really free in what they did. But then, of course, as Isabelle also mentioned, this foreign police was really strong in Switzerland, and I'm not sure how they intervened in the organizations themselves. So, but I know that there was a central committee for refugees in Switzerland, not only for academic refugees, but for refugees from Germany in general. And there, upon a certain point, one man of the foreign policy was always with the committee on their sessions. So they had a strong influence and view on this work.
Thank you.
Was this, there was a second question, or is this the answer?
No,
okay.
That was it. Thank you very much.
Okay, so as I don't see any. Okay, so thank you for this animated discussion. I think if I see correctly, it's time for a break, right, Stefanie? And
exactly, we take a 20 minutes break to just get some off-screen time and come back here at 11 with a panel on Switzerland, actually. Okay, have a good break.
In the 1930s and 1940s, but now the focus lies on Switzerland. Stefanie Salvisberg and Isabelle Haffter will talk about Swiss universities and Swiss policies during this time. As Stefanie Salvisberg's research concentrates more on application policies at Swiss universities, Isabelle Haffter, as I understand it, takes a closer look on the emergence and development of theatre science. Both presentations will have a common ground, I think, as Swiss policies play a role and an important role in both processes. So Stefanie Salvisberg holds the first presentation. She is a historian and works since October 2019 with me in the project of Stefanie Mahrer, named Wissenschaft transnational, die Schweiz und die akademischen Zwangsmigranten 1933 bis 1950. Stefanie Salvisberg studies in her PhD thesis the appointment practices of Swiss university during the NS period. She studied history and German literature at Bern University and worked also as a research assistant at the Archives of Contemporary History in Zurich. Her main fields of interest are the history of science in the 20th century, history of migration and exile studies, as well as history of universities in Switzerland and transnational networks. Her presentation is entitled "For a Swiss Citizen, Switzerland Should Provide: The Appointment Practices at Swiss Universities and the Case of Alexander Weinstein." Stefanie, I'm looking forward to your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll share the presentation. So is it working?
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for the introduction, Sinja, and welcome to my presentation, which I would like to commence with a quote from an appeal by the High Commission for Refugees published in 1935. I cite, "The security of science is threatened, and this challenge can only be met by demonstrating that academic freedom still exists and that the international community of scholars knows how to assist those of its members who are unable to continue their work in their own countries. It is of the utmost importance that this work, which will have its place in history, is brought to a successful conclusion, because in a moment of crisis, the universities will have proved their fidelity to their deepest traditions. This appeal, titled A Crisis in Academia, asked for financial support for all those academics who had lost their positions at German universities following the law for the restoration of the professional civil service of April 7th of 1933. It promotes an international solidarity in science that should go beyond national borders. The universities were called upon to remember their role as, I cite, guardians of academic freedom, and were asked to support the continuation of the research activities of exiled academics. How Swiss universities positioned themselves in this context and how they dealt with forced academic migration is the subject of my dissertation project, which is, as already mentioned, part of the SNF Prima project led by Stefanie Maurer. Especially for German-speaking scientists, Switzerland was an obvious immigration destination, both linguistically and culturally. However, the prevailing discourse of the infiltration by foreigners, in German Überfremdung, and anti-Semitic resentments inside the federal authorities, as well as within the police for foreigners, had a direct impact on the way refugees were dealt with. Immigration was restricted and eventually almost completely prevented. Those who found entry into Switzerland were usually admitted only temporarily. The decision on who was appointed to the universities, as Marino already mentioned yesterday, was not the responsibility of the federal authorities, with the exception of the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, ETH, but of the cantonal governments. In this context, due to this cantonal autonomy, the universities held a special position. The history of academic migration to Switzerland from 1933 to 1945 has not received much attention so far, although the role of Switzerland during National Socialism and the Second World War, as well as Switzerland's attitude toward refugees, have been the subject of numerous research projects. The history of Swiss university was mainly dealt with in anniversary publications, where the questions of academic migrations were also addressed, but not discussed in much detail. Essays that deal explicitly with the above-mentioned topic are usually limited to one university or discipline. Alexander Weinstein's career path has so far been discussed rather superficially, and his relationship with Switzerland has gone almost completely unnoticed. A detailed bibliography will be shown at the end of this presentation. The main sources for my project lie in the cantonal state's archives, in university and private archives, and in the Federal Archive. In this case here, the Bodleian libraries in Oxford have kindly sent me an additional digital dossier on Alexander Weinstein, which is held in the archives of the Society for the Protection of Science and Learning. In today's presentation, following the career path of the Swiss Jewish mathematician Alexander Weinstein, his story will be told and linked to the appointment practices of Swiss universities. First, I will go into some detail about his biography up to his dismissal in 1933. Like many other academics dismissed in Germany, Alexander Weinstein then submitted requests for teaching positions at Swiss universities. Therefore, the second part focuses on how Swiss universities and cantonal governments dealt with these requests. While these were mostly put out into the blue, Swiss universities also had to fill chairs that had become vacant or had been newly created, for which professors were also sought through public advertisements. Exiled academics, including Alexander Weinstein, also applied for such positions. The last part deals therefore with the appointment procedures and practices of Swiss universities, with special attention to the institutes of mathematics. The case consequently illustrates the difficulties faced by academics forced to migrate, and at the same time provides an insight to appointment procedures at Swiss universities, as well as into different assessments of the crisis in academia mentioned at the beginning. Alexander Weinstein was born in 1897 in Saratov, Russia. After he finished middle school, the family moved to Germany, where he studied in Würzburg and Göttingen. In 1915, he continued his studies at the ETH in Zurich, where he also received his doctorate. He soon after applied for Swiss citizenship, which he received in 1925. After research stays at the University of Leipzig and Rome, he returned to Zurich, where he became a private lecturer in 1927. 1 year later, Alexander Weinstein and Marianne Ganz were married. From this year onwards, Weinstein worked at the University of Rossaf, or in German Breslau, as a private lecturer. For a short time, he also did research at the University of Hamburg. In the spring of 1933, he was in active exchange with Albert Einstein, who wanted to bring him to Berlin as a fellow researcher. However, the negotiations were interrupted by political events, and Weinstein was dismissed in the fall of 1933. He then went on to Paris, where, due to the fact that he was not German but Swiss, the continuation of his career had become even more difficult, since the French aid committees for the support of expelled scholars took the stance that Switzerland would actually have to provide for a Swiss scientist. And nevertheless, Weinstein received a grant from a French aid organization for the first half of 1934, which allowed him to continue his research at the Collège de France in Paris. In October of the same year, he was invited as a guest lecturer at 4 Dutch universities. Afterwards, he received a research grant from the British aid organization, the Academic Assistance Council, initially for 9 months, and worked at the universities of London and Cambridge. At the same time, he also tried to obtain teaching positions at Swiss universities. He was thus one of many who tried to continue their academic career in Switzerland. After April 7th of 1933, Swiss university staff and the respective cantonal directors of education had received numerous personal visits and letters from academics who had been dismissed in Germany or had given up their position out of moral or political conviction and were hoping to take up teaching or research activities in Switzerland. There had been no general binding agreement between the federal authorities and the cantons on how to deal with these requests. However, in the spring of 1933, the federal police for foreigners had given instructions, I cite, not to allow the Jewish element to grow excessively. In the end, Swiss universities decided to reject requests in general. Exceptions should only be made if the cases fulfilled the internal criteria of, I cite, great urgency. Such a claim was rarely made, so that only few of the requests effectively led to teaching assignments. Besides the questions of urgency, the rejections were usually justified by the difficult financial situation. However, protectionist reasons and anti-Semitic prejudices also played a significant role. In the discussions at the ETH on how to deal with academic migrants, it was repeatedly pointed out that we in Switzerland must strive at all costs to prevent the emergence of a Jewish problem, which is why, I cite again, special caution was called for in the hiring of Jewish scholars. An expression of Swiss anti-Semitism becomes apparent here. Anti-Jewish policies were pursued as an alleged defense against anti-Semitism. These considerations, even if not explicitly expressed, may also have played a role in the decision to turn down Alexander Weinstein's request. Officially, the rejection, as in many other cases, was justified with the rather flimsy explanation that, I said, real help could only be provided by a permanent teaching assignment, for which, however, no need was claimed. Since Weinstein had previously worked at the ETH, this rejection was all the more disappointing. Also in Basel, despite the statement of the Director of Education, aside that one could now gain some excellent German lecturers who would be an enrichment to our university, it was decided to turn down the applicants on principle. Therefore, Alexander Weinstein's first request was quickly rejected, even though the Russian-born and Jewish full professor of mathematics in Basel, Alexander Ostrovsky, intervened on his behalf. Weinstein, although a Swiss citizen since 1925, was classified as a foreigner, and the application was turned down because one had to proceed, I cite, very cautiously with regard to granting teaching assignments to, I cite, such lecturers. It was only through the intervention of Marianne Weinstein-Ganz, wife of Alexander Weinstein and former student at the University of Basel, that the director of education had the request re-evaluated. However, due to a forthcoming reform of the university law, which would create a second full professorship in mathematics, Weinstein's request was no longer treated as such, but in the context of the controversially discussed reorganization of the Mathematics Institute. On the one hand, Alexander Ostrovsky now primarily advocated the appointment of the well-known German-Jewish mathematician Edmund Landau, since being able to bring such a scientist to the University of Basel was a, I cite, unique opportunity, the likes of which will hardly be found again in a century. The question of granting Weinstein a lectureship should therefore only be considered as a secondary matter. On the other hand, a committee of the faculty, which was responsible for the applications, felt there was no need and rejected the hiring of new lecturers on principle. It is more likely, however, that already at that time there was speculation that the soon-to-be established chair of mathematics would be filled by a lecturer from their own ranks, which is why the hiring of possible competitors was to be prevented. To support their point of view, other arguments were put forward, especially concerning Weinstein's personality. Reference is made to statements by two representatives of the field, which contained, I cite, clear warning that should not be thrown to the wind. The negative attitude towards Weinstein was not very surprising considering their background. Both were German mathematicians and members of the National Socialist Party who took an active part in the dismissal of numerous professors. One of them had previously lectured at the University of Basel and was therefore no stranger to the Commission's members. In the meanwhile, little attention was paid to the many positive reports concerning Weinstein. Furthermore, reference was also made to a letter from a Swiss mathematician who stated that the Swiss universities were not, I quote, supply institutions for distressed academics, and that in the case of new appointments, care should be taken, I said, not to receive any foreign bodies, by which he meant Jewish scholars, as this, he continued, I said, is extremely important for the scientific operation. The cantonal authorities followed the Commission's proposal to reject the request. The final reason given was the difficult financial situation. Further appeals in favor of Weinstein, as well as the promise of two aid organizations to guarantee financial support for at least 1 year, provided Weinstein received a modestly paid lectureship at the University of Basel, did not change anything. During the process just described, which lasted from 1934 to mid-1935, the Academic Assistance Council extended its grants for another year, even though the council was convinced that at some point the Swiss universities had to take some responsibility for Weinstein's future. Since his chances of finding a permanent job in Switzerland were considered higher than in England, despite the previous rejections, he returned to Switzerland in the fall of 1935, but continued to be supported by the AAC. He then held a few lectures at the University of Geneva, and in the spring of 1936, Weinstein applied for the advertised position as mathematics professor at the University of Bern. In the political discussion about labor market control, immigration restrictions, intellectual national defense, and the mainly anti-Jewish debate about infiltration by foreigners, which intensified from the First World War onwards, the development of a so-called Helvetisation of the teaching staff was reflected. Consequently, between 1933 and 1945, the vast majority of professorships were filled by Swiss academics, with a large number of these being in-house appointments. This trend was seen particularly in the field of mathematics. Nevertheless, positions were also still publicly advertised, such as the already mentioned professorship in Bern. 15 people had applied. Weinstein and 3 other Swiss were shortlisted. Of them, Weinstein was by far the most qualified, which was also highlighted in the many letters of recommendation from Swiss, British, French, and Dutch mathematicians. Weinstein, however, feared that mainly non-professional factors would be the deciding ones. He wrote to the AAC, I cite, "There is no doubt that in the German part of Switzerland, especially in Zurich, the anti-Semitic tendency has considerably increased since Hitler. Undoubtedly, there will be a strong anti-Semitic pressure on Bern, opposing the influence of several Swiss mathematicians who are still disposed to support me. Of course, nobody here would admit openly that an anti-Semitic tendency does exist." Finally, hardly any reasons were given as to why Weinstein was not nominated for the position. The Commission only pointed out that the positive impressions given by the letters of recommendation had been described as exaggerated by 2 representatives of the field. The professorship was then filled by Hugo Hadwiger, a young mathematician from Bern who had just habilitated. The job profile had been adapted in such a way that he could be presented as the most suitable candidate to the cantonal government, which had little knowledge of the subject. Besides the University of Bern, Lausanne and Geneva each had to fill a professorship in mathematics as well in 1936. In Lausanne, the position was not advertised and a Swiss mathematician was appointed. Later that year, the very same mathematician was also appointed to Geneva. Again, there had been no public advertisement. This course of action left Weinstein frustrated, as the filling of the chair in Geneva had been initiated by the same people who had previously strongly supported his nomination in Bern. Weinstein wrote to the AAC about this incident, I cite, "The explanation of this intrigue is the following. The faculty of Geneva, which pretends to care about international cooperation, was urged by Paris to support me. They did so in Bern, but it was in mere eyewash. On the spot, they are as anti-Semitic as the others." After these events, Weinstein no longer saw any chance of finding a position in Switzerland. He then went back to Paris, where he obtained a second doctorate in 1937, hoping to increase his chances of getting a position at a French university. In the following years, he was able to continue his research at different French universities and also in Scotland. After Germany's invasion in France, the Weinsteins fled to Portugal and from there to the USA. There, finding a permanent position was difficult. He worked at various universities before finally becoming a full professor in 1948 at the University of Maryland. In conclusion, it can be stated that, especially abroad, Weinstein's scientific achievements were much appreciated, which reflects in the support he received from English and French aid organizations, although it was repeatedly pointed out that Switzerland was supposed to provide for a Swiss. However, as shown, Weinstein, although Swiss citizen since 1925, was, because of his Jewish and Russian origin, often not categorized as real Swiss. In the context of a so-called Helvetisation of the teaching staff and the mainly anti-Jewish debate about foreign infiltration, this meant that he stood little chance of obtaining a position at a Swiss university, and it was therefore not surprising that he was not included in the much praised promotion of the country's own young scientists. Even with the support of his broad network, nothing further could be achieved. How exactly the results presented here can be transferred to other disciplines remains to be investigated. However, the case of Alexander Weinstein shows that the crisis in academia was interpreted in diverse ways. While some took up the arguments of the high Commission for Refugees, and additionally saw the possibility of gaining renowned academics. For others, the protection of the labor market, the debate on foreign infiltration, and financial aspects lay in the foreground. For many, as for the Weinsteins, the crisis in academia was just as much a personal crisis in which opportunities had to be sought to continue research activity, whereby a broad network as well as strategies of adaptation were essential. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to questions in the discussion round, but first and foremost to the next presentation. And I give the floor back to Sinja. Sorry.
So perfect. Thank you, Stefanie, for your very interesting presentation. And before I will introduce Isabelle Haffter to you, I have to say that this presentation will not be live streamed. So Alexander's presentation, which was interesting, and I think we have a lot to discuss, and I want not to say too much. Yeah, raise your real or virtual hand, and then yeah, it's open to question for everyone. If no question is there for yet, I can perhaps start with a question. It is for Isabelle, and perhaps also Stefanie can say something to it. You talked about the Helvetization and anti-Semitic motifs. And is it possible to distinguish the two thematics? I mean, or how are they interconnected? Because as I understand it, the Helvetization was against against anti-Semitic tendencies coming from Germany, as you explained, no? But there were also anti-Semitic tendencies at Swiss universities and in Swiss governments. So how can the two things be interconnected or distinguished, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. And as I was listening to the presentation of Stefanie, I was thinking about this term Helvetization because I don't use it in my talk, or I didn't use it. So I think this is a very important approach to look at this. And while I was giving my presentation, I was a bit smiling inside myself because I thought the arguments which I pointed out came from the faculties. The third point that there was no suitable person who could represent the chair of theatre studies. And I would say that there at this point of argumentation, one should do research on how much, well, in this case, there was also no application, no advertisement for the chair. I mean, the process of the conversation was not at that point. So I can't say, as Stefanie could say, that there were applicants who were Jewish, but they were rejected. I can't say that in this, but I think, of course, it's very important to look at each and every protagonist. And I mean, there were people in some organizations who were Jewish, were Swiss, and were Jewish. As I pointed out in the case of Bern, there was the decan of the university who was very keen on the idea of founding an institute for theatre studies, and he was he was German and came in 1923 to University of Bern. And while the NS regime was rising, he applied for the Swiss Bürgerschaft and became it, and then he was Swiss. So I mean, what I wanted to say is that yes, I would agree what you say. I mean, there are tendencies in both directions, and it comes together, these two discourses. I mean, the cultural nationalist Swiss policy of intellectual national defense and anti-Semitic arguments. But I would give a chance to every single academic and look at their single position and look what the arguments are on each and every single case. So,
yeah. I can say something as well to your question. I think, as Isabella said, it's important to look at the different cases and the different argumentations that were brought up by the faculty members or whoever else was involved in this process. And I think as well that the debates about like the infiltration by foreigners, like the Befremdungsdebatte and the intellectual national defense, they were interwoven. So yeah, you can't really separate them. And I mean, it all started after the First World War, or it increased after the First World War, and it was anti-Jewish, but also like there's you can see a decrease in appointments of foreign professors altogether. So yeah.
Yeah, and to add something from this theatre historical perspective, it was not only against Jews, but also this whole idea of building a specific Swiss theatre culture, and which you might distinguish from something like a German culture. And this debate is going on way before the First World War. So I think this comes also. You should also take this in account when you're talking about this intellectual national defense. So Switzerland with this 4 different languages, 4 different cultures, tries very hard to unify or identify a national identity, a cultural identity, and also a kind of a Swiss academic culture. And in this, in this context, I think it's also important to take this context in account.
Thank you. Then Tekla, sorry, I did not see your hand before, but now you can.
Thank you. I'm having trouble with my internet connection. I hope this will work. Thank you very much for both of your presentations, especially for me, who's not really familiar with the Swiss context and university history. This was really really inspiring, and especially the second talk, as I'm interested in the history of the discipline of theatre studies. This, to me, or your approach seems very promising, as I think there has been so much focus on certain schools in a way repeating the self-historicizing of academics from the beginning of the discipline, who really focused on their different schools and who founded this discipline in a kind of self-historicizing. So the international networks to me seem really interesting and under-researched. I have a question for Isabelle, accordingly, about the careers after 45. We're going to focus tomorrow on an uninterrupted career and the ways how that was manufactured. But in your case, it was not only due to political engagement of the actors, but there was also certain ideas of völkische ideas or ideas of a Swiss culture that were distributed in a way, but outside of academia, I suppose, after 45. Can you say something about their engagement with theater culture, or the ways they, where did they work? Who did they talk to?
Yeah, thanks for your question. I mean, that's the core of my research, which I'm going to do over the next years. But yeah, as far as I can see it, you really need to see the heterogeneity, yeah, of the culture in Switzerland. And I mean, there are very important figure on the side of the avant-garde. And besides that, there are also this kind of people who are intrigued maybe by Völkisch ideas and try to kind of combine this maybe with something like a Swiss theatre culture. And where do they work? Very prominently, Isabelle could engage into the government, the Swiss government, and had a very close kind of friendly relationship to Philipp Etter, the Bundesrat. We have 7 Bundesräte in Switzerland, and the one Etter had the authority of the Abt Innere, the department of the Innenpolitik. And so Isabelle was able over almost 20 years to stage huge festivals, Festspiele, open-air Festspiele, during, I mean, the 30s, 40s and 50s. And so there you have your continuity thesis, for example. So Isabelle is a protagonist who's very interesting, I think, which needs more insight to look how his biographical ways goes, takes some curves, so to say.
Marino?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for both the presentations, very interesting. And I have 2 different questions, I think, one for Stefanie and one for Isabelle. Stefanie, it's not very inventive, but I'm just going to give back the question you asked me today about the 2 different language regions in Switzerland. I mean, in the case you presented, obviously there doesn't seem a big difference between the appointment practices in Geneva and Bern, or what it was when Weinstein says it's all the same anti-Semite. But can you see it maybe from other examples that there actually were differences between especially Geneva and Lausanne and maybe the German-speaking universities in these appointment practices, or was it all the same? Obviously it depends on the case. And Isabelle, a question for you. I don't know anything about this, although this is the second talk I hear from you, but one thing that came to my mind is Catholicism. What role does it play here? Because if I hear Etter and if I hear this people studying in Fribourg and you have the same, so what role does Catholicism play in these questions?
Should I start? Okay. Yeah, I haven't been to the archives in the Romandy yet, so I can't really, I don't have like a lot of results, but from what I saw so far is that, for example, Basel was the most like open university in Switzerland, even more than Geneva from what I've seen so far. Even though Geneva represented itself as like, as in the quote, or also was stated as like really open, but I really have to investigate more. And yeah, and what I also saw in the case of Weinstein, he also applied to the University of Fribourg in 1928, and also there it was the same, and he wasn't, he didn't get the job because of like the confessional obstacle was too huge, because he wasn't Catholic, but even more because he was Jewish. So, but I'm looking forward to go to the archives in Lausanne, Geneva, Neuchâtel, and Fribourg. So maybe next time I can give you some more information about it.
Yeah, and about the question of Catholicism, Yeah, it's a very interesting point, and I am trying to figure out what role the religious background of each and every single protagonist has. What I can say already is that the SGTK, so the Swiss Society for Theatre Culture, was founded in Lucerne, and as you know, a very Catholic, traditionally Catholic area. So many members have a Catholic background, but not everyone. And I would say, as you might know, that Etto also has the same background and is a very Catholic type of politician was. And so I think there are many interesting different roots who come together. Also the theatre historical tradition of so-called Mysterienspiele, which has also a background in the religious context, and which was one of the research areas of the SGTK. So I would say, yes, I need to do more research on that, but it's already on my mind. So thank you for this question.
And there is a question from Stefanie Mader.
Yes, thank you to both of you for two very fascinating talks. I have a question, like I have two questions, one for each. Maybe first, Stefanie, can you already see a difference between the different faculties, not only looking at different like university cities, Protestant cities, Catholic cities? We've talked about the French-speaking part of Switzerland and the German-speaking part of Switzerland, but what within the same university? Is there already something you can say about that? As I'm just thinking about the hiring process of Ernst Freudenberg in Basel at the Faculty of Medicine in 1938. He was not Jewish, but so-called Jüdisch versippt, so his wife was born Jewish. And this was part of the discussion in the hiring process, but in the end, he did get the job. He was hired from Germany after he was dismissed there, which obviously stirred a lot of discussion within the university and within the broader public, so to say. But there, what I've read in the sources, it was quite clear that it doesn't matter what religion someone has, we need to get the best. And Freudenberg, even though he was older and he was German and his wife was Jewish and he was dismissed, he was considered the best. And this sort of discourse was the stronger one than the ones who came up with all kind of reasons why he cannot be hired. So are there like difference between the faculties, or is it really a case-to-case decision in every case? And my question for Isabelle Haffter, not knowing much about theatre studies, and I'm wondering how close or what the relationship is between actual theatre culture, the theatre performances, and like the academic field of theatre studies. And here I'm thinking of the Zürcher Schauspielhaus with its exil ensemble and the performances which were quite controversial, at least in the 1930s under Ferdinand Riese. And if this this foundation of Pro Helvetia in 1938 and sort of dieses Schweizerische Theaterwissenschaft and theater culture is also a reaction to this sort of exil theater or political theater that was being put on stage in Zurich mainly.
Thank you also for your question. Or for your questions. I think it's, I have to look from case to case, but sometimes I can also see like, or I think if I can go deeper into the sources, there will also show like differences between the faculties. For example, in Basel, in the theological faculty, I think they appointed 4 academic migrants, and I think 3 of them were before in Bonn. So it was like, yeah, a circle. They attracted like the next one and the next one, and it was the policy of this faculty. But in the natural sciences, they were more opposed to, like, as we saw also in the case of Weinstein, they were opposed to like appoint, or more opposed to appoint academic migrants. They did as well, but it was the director of education intervened. So just because he wanted to appoint someone, he just overthrown the decision by the faculty. So yeah, and what I've seen so far, there is in the medical faculties they hired a lot of like academic migrants, or in Bern they did not hire one, but they promoted Jewish scholars, which is also not that common in that time. So, and it was always this discussion about the best of the field, but especially in Bern, it was just because of pressure from outside, because Geneva said, otherwise, if you don't promote him, we just take him. So, and there were no other like medicines in this area, so they had to finally promote him. Yeah, but I'm not, at the moment I'm looking from case to case, but I think I will see some more strengths in faculties. Yeah.
Yes, and to my question about the theatre historical context in maybe case of Zurich, and I think that's a very important point, also the federalistic system of Switzerland, and each and every city, when it's a theatre city and combined with the university city, as in case of Basel, Bern and Zurich, and Geneva, of course, and so on. And you really need to look who's in the government, who is in the so-called Erziehungsdirektion, who are the faculty members at this time when you look at a certain conflict. Talking about Zurich, it's very important to see that, of course, after the Second World War, Switzerland was very proud to tell that we had this Exiltheater under Ferdinand Rieser, but we should never forget that Rieser, the successor of Rieser was Oskar Welterlin, and he was very close to this whole cultural nationalistic politic of intellectual national defense. And he was very close to this debate on the so-called Überfremdung of Swiss theatres. And he was also very political, culture political, then involved in all these discussions. So I would say that at the time when this approach from Pro Helvetia, who is not an anonymous institution, I mean, there are also protagonists within who are very close connected to Oskar Welterlin and then the Schweizerische Schriftstellerverband, the Writers Association. And I think there's kind of a break between Rieser's kind of Exiltheater tradition, this political anti-fascistic way to do theatre also, and then the kind of more nationalistic way where after 38, I think 39. And so it comes there together, and I think, as I said in the presentation, it's very interesting to see this sovereignty, political sovereignty of the universities. That was surprising for me. So when this question from Pro Helvetia comes, or this claim comes to the different cities, to the different universities, that every single university on their own, as I get the impression, could really decide whether they wanted to discuss this call or not, and who they might post on this position as a temporary lecturer. So I think there's also a division between the cultural agenda and then the decisions which every single university on their own make. So they didn't put a national, a kind of Swiss nationalistic culture type of figure on a chair. They didn't do that. So I see an independence.
Are there any more questions? I see no hands, but perhaps it's me. No. Okay, then I propose to go a little bit earlier to lunch. And thank you, Isabelle and Stefanie, for your interesting presentations, but also the discussions that gave a bit more insights into Swiss policies, I think, which was, yeah, hopefully not only interesting for us Swiss, but also for the internationals here. Now, Stefanie, you will give some more information, or?
No, not really. Just going to a lunch break. We meet back here at 2 for another very fascinating panel, the last one for today. Okay, have guten Appetit. To not have this completely Eurocentric view, even though, I mean, one of the focal points of this conference is actually on Europe. So we have a panel with 3 presentations on working in exile. And when I was thinking about this panel, I remembered Theodor Adorno, who said in his book Minima Moralia, that every intellectual, this is a quote, in emigration is without exception mutilated, and does well to acknowledge it to himself if he, and we should include she, wishes to avoid being cruelly apprised of it behind the tightly closed doors of his self-esteem. He was speaking, of course, of his own biographical disruptions, the expropriation of language, political isolation, and career breaks, things we can all see when working on biographies in exile and working in exile. The emigres faced, as we have seen with Adorno, alienation, racism, impediments, and often psychological difficulties in exile, both in private and in their professional lives. But however, precisely because emigration emerges from a crisis, it can bring out innovations and result in scientific and social achievements, which, according to the historian Dan Diener, I quote, would have hardly been expected under conditions of steadiness and continuity of life plans, end of quote. And I think this is something, I guess, our first speaker of this afternoon will take up in her talk. I'm going to quickly present Linda Erke, and we proceed like in the panels before. We have the 3 presentations and then have a collective discussion in the end, if everyone agrees. So Linda Erke is a historian and is working as a postdoc at the Institute for Contemporary History at the University of Vienna. And in her Habilitationsprojekt, second book project, however you translate this to English, she is working on the migration of scientists, scholars from Austria to Latin America in the years 1930 to 1970. And I would like to give her, pass on the word. So I found out. Thank you so much. This was fascinating. And I already have a whole list of questions for the discussion, but I'm equally happy to now quickly present our second speaker of this afternoon. And this would be Rodolphe Ink. He has a PhD from the University of Cambridge and is now a lecturer in global history at the University of Portsmouth. His research interests revolve around modern China and post-colonial Latin America in the 19th and 20th century. And I would like to ask Alexander. Vielen Dank. Thank you so much. I changed back to English. I have quite a number of questions to discuss, but I would like to all three panelists actually, but I would I prefer to give the floor, open the floor for your questions and remarks, comments first. Please raise your hand virtually or real. Yeah, Isabelle.
Well, thank you so much for these three inspiring presentations. And I have a question that goes to Rudolf and Linda, because what I think is very interesting that you both spoke of luck, and well, the way you presented the biographies, I very much agree that those happy circumstances, like coming to particular places where really a task was there to fulfill them, which really matched perfectly with the scientific profile. At the same time, Rudolf, in your introduction, you were talking about academic networks, so global academic networks. And Linda, you also alluded to this topic by talking about the scientific hegemony, white scientific hegemony in the field, so not only in the field of archaeology, but in general. And I was wondering if we somehow can trace this luck issue or reword it in terms really of networks and past dependencies. So just to get it out of this corner of like very individual, not calculable contingent element. Yeah, I would love if you could expand on that a little bit. Thanks.
Just go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Isabella. I think the more you study a biography, the more on the one hand you think, oh, that's luck, but in real, when I studied Clavadetscher, first of all, I always thought, oh, so much luck, and so much coincidence. And the more you study her and these kind of biographies, the smaller luck gets. I mean, there are some things we can't calculate, but for me, for example, her luck is getting smaller and smaller every month I'm studying her. I don't know if it's an answer for you, but that's what I see. Working about her as a successful scholar. I mean, what's the opposite of luck is how it's in English? Not luck. Pech. Oh, I don't know. I think I said the more I study her, the less luck I find in her career in the end. And I'm a historian, so I'm searching for reasons for the circumstances, obviously. But maybe Rudolf has a better answer.
I wish I did. I think comparable to that really is that, I mean, yes, I mean, if I do not attribute Misch or many other success to luck, then I have to attribute that in the case of Misch to his almost obsession of what he does, what he did from the days in Göttingen to Himalaya, to China, to India, and then finally to the US. So in the diary of other Chinese colleagues that I read about Misch was that they mentioned the fact not only he was hardworking, but he was single-mindedly hardworking, meaning that there were opportunity for him to earn much more money at the time by working for the government of China. He turned that down because that would take away his time to do real research in the mountains. So that was certainly part of his dedication to his work. And I think without that dedication, I think people would respect him less. And with the work that he does right now, I think people respect a lot more. And accordingly, they protect him at all costs.
Yes, thank you. I also had this noted here, the role of luck in academic careers. It's a very interesting question to ask yourself if you work with biographies. And I think it was Sinja in the morning who said we also try to study like unsuccessful careers, right? We try also in our project to look at the ones who didn't make it. And this might help finding an answer also to, you know, what were actually what factors played a role. But I would like to give the word to Robert now.
Thanks a lot for all these interesting insights. I do have actually a couple of questions to Linda, because I think the biography of Grete Mostny you presented is like really fascinating, all these steps. And first of all, I wondered if you found like any evidence why she reacted that quickly in 1938, because I think like many of those becoming targeted after the so-called annexation in Austria, they stopped like moving. I don't know how to say it for a while, and just didn't react as fast to this. I think it's very fascinating that she moved so quickly, and especially also in her academic career, moved that quickly. And then I also wondered when she came to, or when she started establishing herself in Chile. You mentioned, I think if I have it correctly in my mind, that in 1943, I think she rose to this position as department head. And you brought up some interesting points in that regard and on why she rose to that position. And I wondered if it is possible to like kind of assess what was the key factor. Did she like get this position because of her like favorable education from Europe, or did she actually raise to that position because you hinted at it, I think, because she like provided this background of a white European academic researcher who came here and who was maybe, this is my question, like preferred to local researchers in that way, as she offered like this different, not only academic and educational background. And then my last question, sorry, then I stop with this tirade. You also mentioned that like after 1945 and the end of World War II, she's like her career further improved in Chile. And if I also have it correctly in mind, I think in 1955, you mentioned she became like assistant professor at the university. And I was wondering, because I'm doing research at, in the Argentinian, the neighboring country, and I know from Argentina that in the first 2 decades, maybe after the end of World War II, we see that especially this field of archaeology and so on was dominated by, well, also Europeans, but who came with a different background, who came because they had to flee basically after 1945 because they were former fascists or national socialists. And I was wondering, did you stumble across any hints so far that there was an interaction? How could she interact with people like this in a scientific field, I guess, which was not like a vast field at that time, personnel-wise, in South America? So I think she would have had to come across some of them. And was she confronted in any form with anti-Semitism? Sorry for all these questions, but I think it's a really like fascinating biography.
Thank you, Robert. The pity is that I don't have any sources from Grete Mostny. So I can't say, for example, why she knew that she better leaves Vienna in 1 or 2 days, go to Milan, Brussels, and then to Chile. I just know that her family, or part of her family, now lives in the United States, and they said they have papers I could have the day we are allowed to travel. So I'm looking forward to these sources. So I don't know how she managed to escape that fast. I mean, she tried to escape even earlier than 39, but the first visa to Chile was denied as well. And the part she wanted to have a doctorate. When I think she became head of the department first because she worked for a very long time for no money. So I don't know how, but she could afford working for free. I mean, we all know all the people working for free, they are very popular in science, but actually we need the money. So she could work for free. Then she really rapidly started networking and working together with other archaeologists. So she, in a few years, she had a huge and very good network already. And there was no education in Chile at this time to be educated for this position. Actually with her and a little bit earlier, but it took until the 50s, 55, till her and the curriculum in 66, when Chileans could be educated in this field. So that was like a mixture of, it's a combination, but there wasn't such a big competition. And for example, when she started working on these two sarcophags, nobody in the museum even knew how to work with them. And then suddenly a woman from Europe comes saying, I worked a few months in Egypt, and I wrote my PhD about Egypt and the women in Egypt on this time. So that's it's really a net of structural coincidences or chances. And after 45, when the Nazis, for example, came to Argentina and Chile, I don't know if they had contact, but I know that they wrote it. They were reading the texts she was writing, for example, and then giving a review in another journal. So there was an interaction, but I don't know in personally or just via their professional output. I've been to Chile 2 years ago for 3 weeks just to check out if I can work about Demosthenes, and this happened. So I want to go back again and have a more detailed look on that. But but there must be a connection. Herself, she got the chair in 50 and 55. She inherited the chair of an US American professor. So it wasn't a German contact she had. She had more contacts to the United States and to these kind of scholars. But hopefully I will know more with after my next trip. Yeah.
Yes, we all hope to travel again. Any further questions? Otherwise, yes, Isabelle.
I don't know if I may, because I already posed the question. Okay, thanks. So it's again a question to Rudolf and Linda, because I think these two papers speak so well with one another. And this is the question regarding Europe. So Linda, you had a quite clear stance on that, saying, well, Grete Demosthenes was successful because she was European and because there was a high esteem for European science. But Rudolf, as you said, I somehow had as you outlined, I had the impression that, this is a question actually, did this European education and background of Misch really play a role? Because there, at one point you said his success, or let's say success, but his reception in the US was based on the fact that he brought knowledge to the US, which was unknown before. And I was wondering, because it's very, very interesting, if you try to somehow position this European legacy, is it really, if you compare your work with one of Linda, would you say there is a very a fundamental difference regarding this point?
I think having the European background absolutely made a difference for him going to China, both in the personal capacity and scholarly capacity. If he weren't trained under Hans Steele, he wouldn't have that credential academically, and certainly he wouldn't be able to get to know the Chinese official who knew Hans Steele. So that's the first part. So I think, again, the scientific education in university at the time, I think, was still in a very early stage in China. I mean, those universities were very new. They rely on foreign professors. Some of them, certainly some of the Chinese students that went abroad and returned. So they rely on those people. So, but going to the US, I wouldn't say it was exclusively because of his knowledge in China, but the China angle certainly helped. And I think the European background going to the US at that time, around 46, it was still very much a positive credential to have. So the European thing plus the China thing, that certainly landed him the invitation by the chairperson at Washington, University of Washington.
Thank you. Any further questions? Otherwise, I use my privilege. If not, I have a couple of questions, but I try to keep it short. I think I have my first. I would like to ask Linda. You listed the parameters which helped for her to succeed or to be that successful, and I wondered. What about the marital status of Grete Mosten? You have not talked about whether she was married or not, or had children of her own. Just from the research, what I sort of read in the field of women in exile is that it was easier for unmarried women, because in other cases they usually just started earning money to to feed their families, while husbands usually try to continue their careers, and women sort of took a step back. So I wonder if you can say something about that, and if you see this like will also to be a reason. And then question also to Julia. I came across Hannah Arendt in New York as an editor at the Schocken Verlag. You see Schocken back here, and the Schocken Verlag in the time when she was an editor, which was quite short actually, because in the end she couldn't work for Salman Schocken anymore. It was mainly Schocken books was made in New York. They were basically bringing out translation from German, right? It was more or less the same program as the Schocken Verlag had in Berlin, and then had them translated. She really tried hard to get Benjamin published in Schocken books. She failed, unfortunately. And I was just wondering, what was the reading audience? I know that Salman Schocken thought that he had to educate the uneducated, uncultured Americans and bring his German, publishing house to New York, and this was not perceived too positively. So I don't know if you can say something about the readership of these translated texts. Thank you.
I answer quick because I want to listen to Julia's answer. It's a very good point. I didn't say. She actually had no social obligations. She was married with a Polish one. He died early, and then she was a single scholar till the 80s. So there no social obligation. A little bit of, she took care of her mother, but not that much. She had a brother with a family there. She could go on Sundays and have dinner. But it's a very good point. I will add to my list of questions to biography. Thank you very much, Stefanie. Good point. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for the question. I have to say that we are really focusing on the time when the exile began. So we are focusing on until the end of the war. So this is later on, but if you look at translations, there's also this phenomenon of exile editors. I mean, publishing houses that are trying to edit German books, for example, in New York or in exile. This is really something that didn't work too good. It seems very logical for us today, but yeah, they thought that they would have an audience, and this was very difficult, and it was already something much more appreciated by the audience, that German philosophers, for example, were translated into English, and there was a kind of elite in New York, for example, that was interested in these kind of books, and authors and philosophers. And it was also because of persons like Hannah Arendt, who were always referring on these philosophers. They were talking about them, and so translations were needed because the audience couldn't read it in English. But it was very hard for Hannah Arendt, for example, to establish this background of German or European philosophy. This is true. So I don't have, I don't know already how the reception of these books was in detail. I haven't focused on that, but I think that until now, I know only that there was a circle of people who really were interested in these translations. So it was not this work like the publishing houses that were trying to sell German books. It was already a little bit better to translate them into English. So yes, it was difficult, but okay to a certain extent.
Thank you. Are there further questions for any of the three panelists? If not, we are shockingly well in time. You can also save up questions for the final discussion tomorrow. And if not, I would close this session. Unfortunately, we can't now socialize as it would have been planned. There was a conference dinner planned for Tuesday evening, where we could engage in more discussions in a more like informal way. But we have more opportunities to talk tomorrow. And with this, I would like to close the day. Again, thank you very much to the three panelists and to everyone who participated in the discussion. And I'm looking forward to seeing all of you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.